Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. It's nice to be back. It feels like a while. I've been talking to a few folk this morning. I was saying, getting back into worship and remembering how to do it's a bit like driving a rental car. You know where you're going and what you want to do, you just don't know where all the switches are. I sometimes feel like that in my own car. But it's lovely to be with you again. It's great to be back, and thank you for being here. Well, this morning's Time for All Ages. It's a story that you're probably familiar with, and it's based on an old story called The Star Thrower. It was first kind of written down by Lauren Easley, but many people know it as various things, Sarah and the Starfish, and so being a Unitarian Universalist, I've got my own version of the story. And the story is basically this, older man, lives in this beach house, and he walks down to the beach, and he's walking along the beach, and it's a beautiful day because it was just like they just had a big storm. And after a big storm, it can be really clear and it can be really beautiful, and the sky was blue. But he noticed this young girl walking towards him, and she kept stopping every so often, bending down, standing up, walking on, bending down, standing up, walking on, bending down, standing up, walking on. He thought, that's peculiar. So he went up to the young woman and said, what are you doing? She goes, well, after the storm, all these starfish got washed up in the beach, and they're out in the sun now. And if we don't get back in the water, and they can't do it themselves, they're going to die. And the man looked around and said, but there's thousands and thousands of them. You can't save them all. And she picked up one of them, threw it, said, I can save that one. And that's where the original story ends. But what I like to think is, what happened next? Did the man just go, oh, that poor, naive child doesn't know that it's not worth it? Did he tell her to stop? It's not worth it. Here's what I hope happened. He looked at that girl as she walked away. She was picking up starfish and throwing them back into the ocean, picking up more starfish, throwing it back into the ocean. Then he thought, I could help. So he picked up a starfish, threw it into the ocean, picked up another one, and then other people saw him and thought, that's a good idea. So everyone in the beach started picking up starfish and throwing them into the ocean. That's how I hope that story ends. And really how that story ends is totally dependent on each of us. And as I'll be talking about later in the sermon, there's a lot of struggles in the world right now. We look at the storms now in Southern California, the fires up in the Oregon border here. There's a lot of hardships in Ukraine, the threat of environmental destruction. And it's often said that people who believe in God say, why doesn't God do something about this? And God's reply is, you're someone, why don't you do something about this? So you think how you would like the starfish story to end, and then do your part to make it happen. So thank you.
It's great to be back and to have Brian back with us again. My summer has been an eventful one, as I noted. With the accepting the offer on the duplex I co-own, I've also been planning marriage next spring. Most recently, last week, I visited with my parents in New York City. My mother had been having difficulty keeping track of her bills because of memory issues. I went for a few days to change over so that I could handle things online remotely. And understand, my parents are fiercely independent, really stubbornly, fiercely independent, and hadn't really wanted any sort of assistance despite being 87 and 90. And it took a lot for them to ask for help. It's been difficult and frustrating to help them from across the country. They also won't move to either me or my sisters. So after getting home, I cleaned out some was cleaning out some old papers, and I found a psychiatric article that my father had wrote and sent to me with a note of his attached to it, which was from 1995. And in the note, he commented on my halmoni, his mother, being unconscious but stable at a hospital in Seoul, South Korea. She survived at that time, although she did pass away a few years later. So this is my father 28 years ago. Talking over how he was caring for his parents remotely. So, made me think about phases of life a lot. Generations pass, decade over decade. We do some of the same things. I know his parents were really stubborn and fiercely independent as well, and it gave him a lot of grief. I hope not to pass that on to my son. As our community here, we have our rites and rituals that stay the same, also some things that are different. For differences, we're continuing with our new Action Sundays starting in September with feedback from the congregations. We'll try that for a second year. So my resolution for myself is to learn more about the history of our congregation here. If I can find some old papers, maybe with a note about trying Action Sundays back in the 90s, maybe it'll make things different for us. I love to learn more about how we got here and understand the continuity, even if we do things differently. So, thank you.
It's always good to start a sermon about our future with heaven knows how we will get there. Just want to set the appropriate expectations here. I don't know if some of you remember, like 3 years ago I gave a sermon and I talked about, that was at the beginning of my ministry. This is now my 4th year here. Seems just like yesterday, doesn't it? But I told it, I certainly aged during that time, Erica. But I told you a story about this group, this tribe in East Africa, who have this different sense of time. We talk about, we tend to think in our Western culture of the future is in front of us and the past is behind us. Well, this tribe see it opposite. They think of the past is in front of us and the future is behind us. And I really like that idea because when you think about it, we know what happened in the past. At least we think we do. We have this idea of what happened in the past so we can see the past. But the future we can't really see. And what I mentioned is that that if you think that through, we walk backwards into the future. We can't really quite see where we're going. We are putting our feet, can't quite see where they're going, and we walk backwards into the future. So having set that appropriate expectations, let's talk about where we are going as a religious community. This is a kind of like a state of the union, state of the church type thing. I think this is a good time to do it, and I want to express my grave disappointment with the calendar that we use. Not here at church, just Western society, because I think 1st of January is a terrible time for a new year. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, this is the new year. The Jewish almost got it right. They started in September, with the lunar calendar. So we've got Yom Kippur coming up in September, and we'll be talking about that. But this idea, this is really the new year. This is the start of the church year, the start of the school year, the start of the college year. This really feels like the new time. So I really think we need to move the whole new year to some time in August. And let's get all the schools to start at the same time. I'm sorry, I can't keep track of it. So, where are we? If we're going to move into the future, where are we now? And I don't think I need to tell you we live in a troubled time, an anxious time. We've got the existential concern of the environmental catastrophe that we're living through. We're seeing signs of it, I believe, in the changing weather patterns. We've got huge political and cultural divisions in our country and in many others. And we've got the joy of an election next year. Look, I don't know what I'd read more, the lead up to the election or the election itself. But it's important. We've got huge economic inequality. We heard during Joys and Sorrows about, and I've just experienced it myself, the struggle with affordable housing in this community. We've got the war in Ukraine, the tragedy in Niger, in Africa. And the pandemic has exposed a huge mental health crisis that many of us are experiencing ourselves, especially many of our youngsters, young adults and youth. And of course, this is on top of all these personal struggles that many of us have. This just the loss of loved ones. It's a really, really tough time. And we need to acknowledge that. And I ask you, what is the condition of your heart right now? What is the condition of your heart right now? I suspect all of us are tender to some degree. And given that, religious community is about heart work. How should we respond? And I've said it many times before, I think, religious community is about mental health. And I don't just mean mental illness, I just mean our mental welfare, our spiritual welfare, our emotional welfare. That is what we care about. That's why we come here as a community. So how do we respond to this mental health crisis, this spiritual crisis, this existential anxiety that I think many of us, perhaps unconsciously, but perhaps consciously, are aware of? In the Time for All Ages, the starfish story, one person picking up, throwing a starfish, that's an act of hope. That what I do as an individual can make a difference. And I think many of us come to religious community to get that sense of hope. Perhaps to regain it, perhaps it's lost. Perhaps to get comforted in times of grief. That's what religious community is about. That's why many of us come. So as a religious community, I'm asking us to deepen our commitment to mental health. I'm asking us to deepen our commitment to connect with one another. Deepen our commitment to justice, to work on those issues we talked about. As I mentioned during the Joys and Sorrows, we all bring our gifts and our wounds here. They're all welcome because both our gifts and our wounds help us to become more compassionate, help us to be more caring, help us to be more loving, helping us to be more just. And one of my big goals for this year is to deepen our spiritual connection with ourselves, with one another, and with the community around us. And we need opportunities to engage in loving action. And religion itself is in a crisis. I was in Scotland this summer, returning back home, and religion has almost disappeared from the cultural landscape, like many places. And even though America's lagging behind in this, I think the same thing's happening in the US. Most religions are in decline. We're kind of staying constant. The Jewish communities are staying constant, but most of the Christian communities are experiencing fairly significant declines. And the pandemic is only making that worse. And I think religion's got itself to blame, because I think for the most part religion did not become relevant to most people. This escape from the everyday life into this idea of salvation in the afterlife was not helpful to people who are struggling in the day in, day out, worried about food on the table, worried about housing, worried about healthcare, worried about education costs. The afterlife didn't matter because the struggle is here and now. So religion needs to change. I want to read you something. Religion, as a deeply ingrained aspect of human culture, could benefit from a transformative shift that embraces inclusivity, adaptability, and critical thinking. This change entails fostering an environment where diverse perspectives are welcome, women and marginalized groups hold equal leadership roles, and outdated doctrines are reinterpreted to align with modern ethical standards. By focusing on shared values of compassion, empathy, and the betterment of society, rather than divisive dogmas, religion has the potential to evolve into a unifying force that promotes understanding among different faiths and contributes to the overall well-being of humanity in an ever-changing world. Okay, I know that's a bit dry. Who do you think wrote it? And do you think it describes Unitarian Universalism? I do. I asked ChatGPT, give me one paragraph on how religion needs to change. That's what it came up with. I agree with everything in there, and I know I was at a meeting a few weeks ago, and Liz Davis, who's doing a tech there, someone asked me a question and I responded to it, and I think Liz said, yeah, I just typed that something into ChatGPT, and it gave a very similar answer to Brian. So I don't know whether to be flattered or concerned about that. For all the dryness, now I could have written something that hopefully would be a little bit more poetic than this is, but factually it describes Unitarian Universalism. Fostering an environment where diverse perspectives are welcome, women and marginalized groups hold equal leadership roles, and outdated doctrines are reinterpreted to align with modern ethical standards. That sounds like Unitarian Universalism to me. But I think this is a problem that we need to address, and we started it with the work that Erica and Liz Sloan did last year. We are so worried about being an evangelical faith that we forget to be an invitational faith. We don't invite people here. We're scared. We're a little bit embarrassed about being a religion. But the future of religion, I think we are on the right track. I think there's a shift going on, and I think Unitarian Universalism is always going to be a smaller religion because we're always going to be pushing the bounds of what religion is, and we'll make mistakes. But there are people right now in Redwood City, in San Carlos, in Menlo Park, in East Palo Alto, who, if they knew about us, would find a home here to help them deal with the existential angst, to help them deal with discrimination and oppression. There are people, if we invite them, they would benefit from. So I understand the struggle with being evangelism. And can we be invitational? Can we open up? And that's one of the goals I have for this year that I was talking to Peter, our president, about. I want this building more used. I want people coming in and out of this building all day, every day, to experience what's happening here. And they can be coming for games, they can be coming for a meal, they can be coming for a joke-telling session, they can be coming for liturgical dance, which I will not be part of, but they can be coming for whatever they want. But we need to get people in and out of this building. We have a resource here that this neighborhood's lacking. Can we get more people in here, groups for parents? Let's make that happen. Let's be invitational. It does not need to be inviting people to the worship service. And we need to be inviting people to connect with their values and serve them however we can. Because the word worship in its literal meaning, is to explore what is of worth. And I know many of us struggle with the idea of worship, of this idea of being submissive to an all-powerful God. I don't even think God's important for religion. Religion is about meaning making. How do we make meaning with our lives? And if you do that through an idea of God, that's great. Can it be through exploring your values? Can it be through exploring this idea of the creative process, this co-creative process that we are engaged with one another and the community at large, to make our values more prevalent in this society? Because we have a crisis in our country. There's a mental health crisis, but there's also a loneliness crisis. I noticed this when I was back in Scotland. And as some of you know, I also visited India in my holiday, and I was talking to my friend who's Indian. I noticed how much street life there was. And I was in Scotland, there was so much street life, and how quiet the streets are in most United States. And people are in their homes, they're isolated. And I think some of us might even be afraid of having that intimate connection with another person. We have, and not everyone is up for everyone, but we need to create an environment here for those who are lonely can come not just on a Sunday, but other days of the week, to have some personal connection, to have someone listening, have someone be present with, have someone care about them. Because we all, to have that sense of belonging, need to feel cared for and noticed and ultimately loved. Meaningful human existence is facing the reality of life with hope, with purpose, and with courage. And religious humility can help us do all of those things, reminding us of our own worth and how each of us are worthy of love. The great Mr. Fred Rogers said, "A child does not need to be sensational to be worthy of love." A child does not need to be sensational to be worthy of love. In typical fashion, I would extend that. None of us need to be sensational to be worthy of love. And I also want our spiritual life to grow beyond Sunday. And one of the things I'm going to start this year at the end of the month, I'm going to be sending out a package on our MailChimp email list of activities we can all do. It will include children and youth, young adults and adults, for activities we can do in our home to explore the worship themes that we're doing. It's called Soulful Home. It's the thing that we get from our worship package. But we're going to be sending that out at the end of the month, which will reflect our worship topic for next month, which is welcome. And these will be stories, there will be questions, there will be activities we can do just to explore that. And I want each of us to try, when we feel we've got the energy, and perhaps most importantly, when you don't feel you've got the energy, try it. Engage in some spiritual practice, spiritual activity. But I always think of the words of the Reverend Harry Schofield, who was a long-time Unitarian Universalist minister at San Francisco, the church I became a member of. And he used to say that he would memorize poetry one day a week, except if he was stressed and busy, and he'd memorize it for two hours a day. And I think he meant it. So religion is about meaning making, it's about interpreting our lived experience. And ultimately, here at Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Redwood City, we are a community of love, compassion, and justice. We foster hope in ourselves, we foster hope and joy in one another, and that may be our highest spiritual calling. So let us more deeply engage our religious values, and in doing so, may we transform ourselves through our search for meaning and purpose, and transform our world through acts of love.